All right, here we are in chapter 6 of the snake crusher who gets us back to the garden. God's people had a hard time not copying everyone else around them. This was especially true when it came to having a king. Although God warned them how bad kings could be, they just had to have one. So eventually, God gave them a king and warned them to be careful what you ask for, you just might get it. The first king, his name was Saul. He was very impressive height-wise and pretty disappointing in every other way. You can read about King Saul in the book of 1 Samuel. Well, the second monarch, another word for king, was young David from Bethlehem. He was definitely much better. In fact, before we get to the king, Jesus, almost no one is more important than King David. When David wasn't busy sinning, which he did in some really big ways, he was a good, wise, and merciful king. Many good things happened to God's people when David was in charge. They were victorious and prosperous and blessed. What do you think that picture is a story of? You see David, he has a sling in his hand. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 2. But the best thing that happened was what God promised would happen. God told David that he would always have a son to sit on the throne. This is known as the Davidic Covenant. He promised David an everlasting kingdom. This was good news for David and even better news for God's people. It meant that God had not forgotten the guarantee he made in the garden. A deliverer was on his way, and now everyone who had ears to hear knew he would be a son of David. Remember that first promise of the gospel in Genesis 3? That through the seed of the woman would come the one who would crush the head of the serpent? And that seed has gone through Noah and Abraham and now through David. And the promise that we're going to get a king who will rescue us. But the next son of David was not the one they were looking for. Solomon started off on the right foot, but he ended up tripping quite spectacularly. What that means is David's love for God began to get cold, and he didn't live for God anymore. He began to live more for himself. After Solomon, the kingdom split in two, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and neither kingdom was very good. You see that crack? That's Israel being broken up, with 10 of the tribes being in the north called Israel, and then Judah and Levi in the south. God punished Israel first, that was the northern tribe, and then Judah. In the course of 400 years, God's people would go from top dog to dog food. They had been kicked out of their promised land just like Adam and Eve had been kicked out of their paradise. And worst of all, David's house and David's throne were no more. The future looked bleak, which means looked very dark, especially for the promises of God. It's a pretty disturbing picture. They don't look like they have hope. And oftentimes in confusion, we ask God, where are you? What are you doing? Don't you love us? Aren't you going to keep your promises? And that was what the people of God were wondering, particularly in those 400 years of silence. Well, that's the end of chapter 6. See you soon for chapter 7.